In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. So I'm going to start out this Sunday with a little confession. I really enjoy shopping. I especially enjoy shopping for stuff I don't really need in places I'll never likely be again. So for example, about 15 years ago, I had the opportunity to be in Istanbul, Turkey. And I went to one of the big markets out there, and I bought this Turkish tea set. Do you know how many times I've had Turkish tea? Another time, when I was in Ecuador, I was in an Indian village in the highlands, and I went to a shop. I met the owner of the shop, a guy named Lorenzo, a very interesting fellow. And there I bought this beautiful hand-woven table runner. That we actually do use, but not on a table, it's on the piano. Not something we really needed. Why do I like to do this? Well, maybe you can relate to what I'm about to explain, and I bet you can because you're human just like I am, right? There's a little part of my brain that feels better and gets a kind of chemical hit when I get something or when I get more of something. And it's pretty easy to get addicted to that hit. Now, in traditional Christian spirituality, this kind of addiction is called avarice or greed. And it's serious enough to be on the list of what was called the 7 deadly sins. This is the big leagues, right? 7 deadly sins. What is greed? Well, one definition is that it is the intense desire to possess more than we need. Jesus, in today's parable, associates greed with money and material possessions, as we often do. But our greed can really take many forms. We might be greedy for power. We might be greedy for attention. We might be greedy for approval. We might be greedy for more and more likes on Facebook, whatever it is. And greed, as Jesus says, is the focus of his parable today. Now, on first glance, from our cultural perspective, it may not seem so. Because when we read the story of this farmer, it seems to us like he did nothing wrong. He happened to have a really good year in the fields. He has all this extra stuff, and he says, I'm going to store this for a rainy day. Don't you remember when you were young, and your mom, my mom would do this, right? She would always say, save your pennies for a rainy day. And so whenever it rained, I would be like, maybe this is the day. Could this be it, you know? But somehow, it never was. It's okay. But then there's the question of how does this parable of this farmer relate to these 2 brothers who basically want Jesus to function as their estate attorney? Well, let's get into Jesus' time a little bit. In Jesus' time, anybody who wanted more was considered to be a thief. You see, the idea back then, which is really no sillier than our ideas, but it's just a different idea, is that all the wealth of the world had been distributed. You couldn't create more wealth. So, you know, if there's a certain amount of water in the bathtub, if I take a little more of that water, there's a little less left for everybody else. Right? We tend to think that there can be this rising tide that helps all ships. Just as odd, but different, right? Back then, that was not the idea. If I got more, it's because I was taking it from someone else who now had less. And one way of getting more was dividing an inherited estate. You see, in Roman law, if an estate were given to a number of sons, and they would be males in those days, right? All the sons had to agree to divide it for the estate to be divided. But in Israelite law, only one son had to want it divided, one inheritor, and all the rest had to deal with that. So this person who's saying to Jesus, make him divide the property with me, I'm the one who wants to divide it, is kind of the cultural bad guy here. He's the person who wants more. He's the person who's greedy. He's the person that's taking what isn't really supposed to be just his. Now, unlike some foolish ancient and contemporary philosophers, early Christian thinkers realized that greed just doesn't help us. It just doesn't work. The paradox of greed is that the more of something I get, the more anxious I become around it. This has been studied, right? Not only do studies show us that after a certain level, which isn't really that high, the more we get of money or stuff or whatever, it doesn't affect our happiness at all. In fact, it makes our happiness dip a little bit. There have also been studies of billionaires. Now, this I find odd, that there are enough billionaires that one can form a sample out of them, right? But apparently there are, right? That studying billionaires and middle-class people, we find that billionaires have more financial insecurity than an average earning person does. So it seems the more of something we have, the more anxious we become around it. Now, all these folks who spent money on these studies could have simply read John Cassian, who wrote in the 400s. He's one of our saints, right? He wrote, "When money increases, the frenzy of covetousness intensifies. The more I have, the more crazy I get." Now, in Jesus' teachings about greed, he's basically quoting from established Jewish tradition. The story he tells of this farmer is actually pretty much exactly the story we find in Sirach, which is a text Jesus surely would have known. And he's drawing on the stereotype of the rich man as the insatiably greedy person who wants to take all the water out of the bathtub for himself. So in Jesus' time, and in Jesus' view, an honorable person would never want more than they already had. To take down my little barns and build big barns is tantamount to taking everybody else's stuff. But what should this guy have done? He simply had a good year in the fields. Farming was considered sort of divine, sort of magical, and if crops did well or did poorly, it really wasn't his fault or anything. But what should he have done? Well, what he should have done, in terms of that culture, is that he should have shared. One can't help it if one gets a little bit extra, but the thing to do with the surplus is to share it. It's the only way to avoid what in those days would have been the shame of having wealth. Wealth was meant to be shared. It was meant to be passed around, right? You could even use it to kind of indemnify others. You know that scene in The Godfather where the Godfather says, "I will do this favor for you, but one day I will ask for a favor in return." This is how one was meant to use wealth. So the problem with the rich man in the parable is that he kept his abundance for himself rather than acting as a generous patron toward others. He uses his resources to isolate and separate himself from others instead of using his resources to build bridges. That is greed. So what do we do if we want to avoid this deadly sin of greed? And I like this old language of these deadly sins. It reminds me that some behaviors, some mental constructs are so toxic that they can turn an otherwise good life into a living death. I think that's true. I've seen that in some people. And in dealing with something as toxic as greed, I think it's way too simple to say, well, simply give away everything above a certain poundage of stuff or a certain dollar amount. Because our early Christian ancestors realized that the roots of greed weren't in the money or the possessions or the power or the esteem or the Facebook hits. The roots of greed were and are in our ego. Working on greed is an inside job. Going back to another early saint, Saint Hesychius, in the 600s, he wrote this. He's writing to monks, right? So he says, "He who has renounced such things as marriage, possessions, and other worldly pursuits is outwardly a monk, but may not yet be a monk inwardly. Only he who has renounced the impassioned thoughts of his inner self, which is the intellect, is a true monk." Now, by impassioned, these kind of stoic thinkers didn't mean passionate and emotional. They meant compulsive and addictive. And so overcoming greed is less about giving up stuff and more about giving up our addiction to stuff. Because if money and stuff is what I use to try to gain security, if money and stuff drives my actions and my decisions, if money and stuff is what I trust, then money and stuff is my God. And I think that's what Colossians means when the letter says today that greed is idolatry. It's as simple as that. And most of us probably know that money and stuff do a pretty terrible job of being God. So how do we counter greed? Well, I've always been a fan of the saying that we can't think ourselves into a new way of acting, but we can act ourselves into a new way of thinking. And I'll give you an example from my own life. There was a time when Lori and I were pretty down on our luck financially. And we had a lot of money concerns. And I could feel the fear coming on me, that fear of financial insecurity. And we both realized that this was toxic stuff. And so we looked in our bank account, and we had, I think it was like $120 or $150. And what we decided to do was give away $100 to charity. Not because we thought magically something was going to happen if we did that, but simply to do an action that wouldn't be driven by fear. To do something else so we could think a different way. And here we are. It all worked out. So how do we do this? How do we conduct ourselves in our current world that's built on profit and competition? How do we uphold the spiritual values of Jesus when we're surrounded by values that are very different from our culture? What does wealth look like if it can be divorced from greed? To answer that, I want to take you back to my friend Lorenzo's shop in Ecuador. When I was looking around his store and seeing these beautiful things that he had made on this hand loom that he and his wife worked, I realized his prices were way too low. And so I thought, I'll clue this poor guy in. So I said to him, Lorenzo, you could raise your prices like 3 times and people would still buy your stuff. And he started laughing. He said, don't you think I know that? He's like, I own 3 businesses in this town. I run a bed and breakfast, and I'm renting 3 farms. He goes, I am the local economy. He's like, I know what prices are. I know what prices are in the U.S. He says, but let me teach you something. He says, I don't raise my prices so that I can be a wealthy person. He says, I don't raise my prices so as many people as possible can buy my things and bring them all over the world. He says, I have more than enough for my family. And I charge just what I need so that the most people possible can buy my things and I can still provide wealth for my family. And as he was teaching me about his idea of money and wealth, which was all about bridge building and relationships, he, just like Jesus, gave me a picture of a last day. And he said, when you people, meaning us up north here, he said, when you people die, you've got a lot of money in the bank. He says, when we die, we've got a lot of people in the church. He said, and to us, that's wealth. Friends, I pray that we may all be free from the compulsion and the fear that leads to greed, that we all may follow the words of Jesus bravely and know the true wealth of the Spirit. Amen.